Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome tonight to the California Association of the Deaf's platform. My name is Kavita Pipalia. I am the president of CAD. I'd like to give you a visual description of my background and myself. I have a black background behind me. I have black hair. I am wearing dark glasses. I have a turquoise necklace. I have turquoise earrings. I'm wearing a white jacket with a black blouse underneath. I am wearing maroon or dark red lipstick, and I have rings on both my ring fingers on both hands. Before I get started today, I'd like to lay some ground rules for tonight. You will have an opportunity to watch our presenter speak during the first 30 minutes of tonight's episode. If during the presentation you are stirred by a question and you are watching in Facebook, feel free to type it in there. If you are watching in YouTube, also type your comment there. We do have a moderator. That moderator is Dr. Marla Hattrack. She will repeat the questions and share them on the platform for us. Please ask questions that relate to the topic presented tonight. If your questions do not relate to the topic, they will not be asked. They will be removed. Second ground rule, we do not accept harassment, bullying, insults of any kind in either Facebook or YouTube chats. That behavior is unacceptable. Third, there will be a question and answer portion this evening. After the presenter's presentation in the first 30 minutes, we will take a break for a couple seconds. During that break, we will inform you of the next webinar that we will be having. We'll be introducing our linguistic policy chief for tonight. This evening is Dr. Marla Hattrack. So Dr. Marla Hattrack, please come on the screen. Dr. Marla Hattrack speaking. Hello, Noel King. So nice to see you here tonight. I have the honor of introducing our speaker tonight. Noel King is currently a mental health clinician as well as an art therapist at Walden School, which is a part of the Learning Center for the Deaf. Our presenter tonight is currently working on their PhD and talking about art expression, expressive therapies with the use of art. So we'll be very interested in that portion of tonight. Noel King is currently, and I apologize, I forgot to mention it, seeking her PhD at Lesley University in Boston, Massachusetts. So I want to recognize that it is probably past your bedtime, right, Noel? This is Noel King speaking. Yes, it is. Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Marla Hattrack. Once again, I'd like to thank the California Association for the Deaf for inviting me to present tonight. My presentation is mental health oriented, and the title of my presentation is The Power of Choices. Before I delve in and get going, I'd like to give you a visual description of my background. I am sitting in my living room. There is a bookshelf directly behind me. Past the bookshelf, there are photos on the wall. Personally, I have short hair. It is dark or black on one side and blonde on the other. It is combed over to the side. I am Korean American. I am light-skinned. I am wearing a black coat, mid-sleeve coat with a cobalt blue blouse. I'd like to provide a land acknowledgement. I am in Boston, Massachusetts, and I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that I live and work on the land of the Pawtucket, the Massachusetts, and the Nipmuc tribes. And I recognize the tribes, and I'm grateful for them for allowing me to use this land. I'll give you a quick introduction of who I am. I am a mental health clinician as well as an art therapist, meaning that I use art to connect in my therapy. I am also a Korean American adoptee. My adoptive family are deaf, so the three of us are deaf. I am bilingual. I speak American Sign Language and English. And as mentioned, I am a PhD student at Lesley University focusing on expressive therapies, including art, musical, dance, movement therapy as well, play therapy, and so on. And those are part of my studies, and it's my second year in the program. The reason I gave a visual description of my background is because I want you to keep in mind where I'm from and how we got here. I do know that it is about 6 o'clock in California. It's early, maybe still having dinner. Here it's 9 o'clock, as Marla said, a little past my bedtime. I do keep myself busy for a majority of the day, and then I take a couple minutes in the evening to settle down. You might have seen something called color meditation. Maybe you've seen it in the past, maybe you haven't. Here's an opportunity, however, for you to think about color meditation, and I hope that I am able to offer you some takeaways today. Today, sit with your feet in a comfortable place. You can cross your legs, have your feet on the floor, sit however you'd like. You can even lay. What's important is relax and rest. I have an image on the slide. It's an emotional wheel. That wheel contains different emotions, different feelings, accompanied by different colors. The colors don't necessarily represent the feeling. You might have a different color in your mind for that emotion or that feeling, and that's okay. For now, let's use the image on the slide as guidance. Next slide, please. So think about your day. You go to school, you work, you're busy. Think about any negative feelings that you picked up during the day. Stress, grief, anger, whatever it may be. If you have that feeling, please pick a color. I am going to pick stress because I felt stressed today. And I am going to pick a color, think of in my mind, and associate that with stress. We can all choose a different color. We don't have to choose the same color. For stress, my selection of color is red. I'm picking red for stress. Folks, I encourage you to pick whatever color you'd like for your negative feeling. I only ask that you keep that color in mind on one side of yourself. Now, on the opposite side, I'm going to ask you to think about the opposite. We've just done the negative feeling. Now we are talking about a positive feeling. I want you to pick a color that represents something positive. So my feeling will be calm, and I'm going to pick a color for that. Your feeling can be exciting, happiness, whatever it is, so long as it is positive. Pick a color in your mind that represents that positive feeling. I selected calm as my emotion, and I'm picking the color purple for my positive feelings. So now I have purple and red on either side of me. And now I want to ask us all to recognize any tension we may be feeling in our muscles. And I want you to imagine aura or fuel, either one of those. Imagine those colors fully embodying your body. So what I will do is I will imagine myself as red. The color has filled me completely. And so we're going to do this along with a guided meditation, a guided breathing practice. And when I ask you to think positive, then you're going to think of the purple color. And so as I inhale, I am going to be inhaling more and more purple. And then when I exhale, I'm going to think of that negative color. And with each breath of air that I force out, I will be forcing out that red color. And you can also imagine it as an aura that emanates from you as well. Okay, if we're ready for the exercise, the next slide will begin. Folks, if we're ready, inhale your positive feeling. Fill yourself with that color. Exhale your negative feeling. Eject or express that color. And then intake or breathe in your positive color. Exhale and breathe out your negative color. Continue in the process. Inhale positive color. Exhale negative color. Once you have enough breaths that you feel you've recycled the air that's in your body and removed the negative color and have filled yourself with positive color, then you'll want to stop. But I recommend you to continue, practice with me. I feel that it is close to my chest. And at this point, I am done. I feel that I have been completely embodied by the positive color, representing the positive emotion. Very well. Next slide, please. I hope that before we start, I've been able to change your energy and turn it into calm, positive energy for this evening. Because now we can focus on the topic for tonight. What is mental health? Why is it important? Maybe you've heard of mental health before. Maybe you've heard positive, negative things, but I really want to talk about why mental health is important. Next slide, please. The image you see on the slide, we understand that we visit the doctor, we visit the dentist when we need glasses, when our teeth hurt, sometimes just for a regular checkup. When we have a physical problem, we typically go to a doctor. Let's say, for example, if you break your elbow, you don't just leave it and move on with life. You go to the doctor, you get your elbow put in a cast, maybe you get it fixed. If it's a different issue, you get it fixed. Our minds have the same needs. However, mental health issues aren't explicit. They're not easy to see. Let's say a person is feeling sad or depressed. What should they do? Well, they should visit the appropriate medical provider, which would be maybe a counselor, a social worker, a psychologist, a psychiatrist. Those are the types of individuals that work on the internal mental processes, just like doctors work on the internal physical processes. Remember, mental health is internal and runs concurrent with our physical health. And so it's very important to keep the relationship between both balanced and healthy. Next slide, please. In general, deaf individuals have a variety of mental health issues that arise. They could be minimal, they could be major. It's important to recognize that mental health issues do arise. And I've been in the field of mental health for over 10 years, so I do see that deaf people experience depression, anxiety, self-esteem, confidence issues, struggle with identity, stress, loneliness, shame, anger, and complex trauma. Deaf children who have access to sign language earlier on tend to fare better than those who don't have access to language early on. That language deprivation has impacts and on these children's mental health and becomes a factor in more mental health issues. That has been proven by research that children with language deprivation are 4 times more likely to struggle with addiction, with mental health problems, with emotional regulation, with receptive language, and so on. So keep in mind that some deaf people experience this, some don't. The deaf community is not a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter type of community. We are all individuals, and it's important to introspect and self-assess. Mental health problems should not be ignored because if they are ignored, they can lead to struggles in the future. It's best to head those off early on. Next slide. Again, I want to remind folks to keep this in mind. Your experience with mental health is your own journey. There is no one standard that we all must adhere to or follow to. We really shouldn't compare each other's journeys. What's important and critical is your mental health, and that you look for a community for support to connect with. Even depression can vary among individuals. And so it's important to visit a mental health professional that can provide appropriate treatment. We shouldn't be judging others saying, hey, you don't look depressed. Perhaps they are. We want to go ahead and recognize and validate people's emotions. Next slide. In general, in terms of mental health, I'm going to share some information. Information on solutions for self-care. And you may have heard of that term before, self-care. Some people are familiar with it, some are not. Self-care is critical. I want to remind everyone, self-care also is not one size fits all. Self-care depends on what you like and what you feel is a good fit for you. Self-care is a way to regulate oneself, mental health needs, and take care of oneself, and is considered an early intervention or early prevention that can be put in place before issues arise. Next slide. We are moving along in the presentation tonight. Mental health can be thought of as a fuel that needs to be checked. We need to gauge ourselves internally. You need to check with yourself how you feel right now, how you're doing. Are you okay? Are you so-so? Are you feeling bad? Are things kind of off? It's important to keep an eye on our own internal fuel gauge. If you can imagine being in a vehicle that has a gas gauge that will tell us when the vehicle's out of fuel. If the vehicle's out of fuel, we can no longer continue to travel. Similarly, emotionally and mental health, we have fuel inside of us, and we need to gauge that. For example, our interaction with family has a gauge that we should measure. Our interaction with our friends, the time that we spend with ourselves, or the time that we spend on hobbies. Our gauge across those categories should be full, and we need to remind ourselves of that. We need to keep an eye, let's say, for example, on our friends gauge. And if we're low on fuel with friends, then we need to make connections with those friends so that the fuel for the friend area is able to be refilled. And only you can assess the levels of the fuel within yourself. So I recommend that you do that. We charge our cell phones on a daily basis and we keep them as full as possible every day. Why don't we also apply that to ourselves and our own mental health? Self-care also should have a stoplight. We want to have those warning signs. We should have a red light, yellow light, green light. Instead of just moving along on automatic mode, we need to take periodic pauses to check in with ourselves to see how we're doing. If we're feeling amiss, let's say, for example, I mentioned that I had a high level of stress today. I need to pay attention to what I'm feeling that day. Tension in my shoulders, lower back pain. Those can be the early warning signs. Realizing that I'm all tensed up in a little ball, helping me understand that my body feels that way because of my stress. So I would do, in that case, some deep breathing to try to calm and lower my shoulders. Or do I have racing thoughts? That is something that will identify to me what threshold my stress levels are at. So keep an eye on your warning signs. Also, I like to add, besides the early warning signs, we all need to be aware of our own triggers and how our triggers affect us. Triggers can occur if we're reminded by someone who reminds us of someone else that we had a bad experience with, someone that upset us, perhaps. So it's important that we watch for those triggers as well. Next slide. Okay, that was the red light. Now we want to talk about the yellow light. Yellow light, as we know, means slow down. How do we slow down when it comes to our mental health? Well, we use coping skills. You might be asking, what are coping skills? Coping skills are the skills that we use to regulate our emotions, our internal emotions. For example, back to my mention of stress. I feel stress, and so I want to do something that will help me minimize those feelings. On that slide, there's an array of options. And one of my favorite options is art. Actually, let me show you one off my desk. This is a piece of art. It's a simple piece. It's just me with watercolors, kind of just painting along in order to disconnect from that stress. Other people disconnect from stress via exercise. And then other folks relax in a hot tub. Some people prefer spending time with their pets. Other people prefer hanging out with friends. You have to make the choice of which coping skill best fits you. And I'd like to add, some coping skills can be very expensive and some cannot. Again, you've got to choose something that's a good fit for you. And I choose art therapy for myself. And coping skills can be applied for depression, for anxiety, and so on and so on. With anxiety, most people use a sensory item like a squeeze ball, which allows them to settle down and cope. Other people use a weighted blanket that they can use to be able to calm and ground themselves. Next slide, please. Okay, remember, we had the red light first, which indicated stop, check in. What are the warning signs? Is an early trigger happening here? And then we know that yellow tells us to slow down, use our coping skills, take care of ourselves, which means what's next is the green light. You've taken care of yourself. You are a healthy self. You are self-compassionate. You are focused on living a happy life. And this can apply with relationships, family, partners, coworkers, just anyone that you come across in your general everyday life. And I'd like to remind you folks, be compassionate with yourself. Self-compassion. Realize that you've survived, made it through challenges. Many people have negative self-thoughts like, I should have known better, I should have done better, I could have, would have. Don't do that to yourself. Recognize that you're human, and all humanity makes mistakes, and we learn from our mistakes. Be caring to yourself, be compassionate to yourself. There's also a practice called mindfulness. Mindfulness creates that mind emotional awareness, which is what allows us to check in with ourselves, to be able to treat ourselves with kindness so that we can be a healthy self. I want to remind you that you are all important. Now, I want to make sure that you're familiar with resources that exist within the deaf community if you need support or help in terms of mental health services. These are nationwide and depends on your insurance provider and their coverage. These resources that I have on the screen will navigate that with you. And we'll start with National Deaf Therapy, My Deaf Therapy, and then there's also Deaf Counseling Center. You can also find a private practice therapist that you can meet with. You can ask your doctor for a referral. You can ask a school counselor for a referral. And these services will be dependent on your state and the resources there. So if we think about CAD, California Association of the Deaf, California is a long, long state, north and south. There are sister agencies to CAD in California. and they cross share and network with information to support each other with resources. It's important to reach out for help and maintain a healthy self. Next slide. That is it for my presentation tonight. If you have any questions on your mind, I will see them come from Marla. Again, don't take your mental health for granted. Mental health is extremely important, equally important as our physical health, and we need to practice every day. And I'm not just preaching to you or at you, I'm also preaching to myself because I myself have struggles. I struggle with depression, I struggle with anxiety, and so I need to apply self-care. I need to be self-compassionate. I need to have my street light with my red, yellow, green light. And I need to work on my coping skills every day so that I can integrate with society and live my life fully. Next slide. If you have any thoughts, any questions, there is a website, my email, reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to respond to your questions as they come in or as are needed. Marla speaking. Noel, thank you so much for such a nice presentation. I know that mental health is a spectrum, a complicated, complex spectrum. So I'd like to ask you uh, a question. The question says, can you talk a little bit about expressive arts therapy? You and I had a meeting yesterday, and in our conversation, the way you explained it to me, I found extremely fascinating. So I'm wondering if you would share the same explanation to help people understand the difference between art therapy and just talk therapy. Can you speak to that? Noel speaking. Definitely. I slightly touched on art therapy. Therapy usually is thought of as visiting a counselor or a therapist in a sit down setting, whether it be using your voice or using sign language. It's a back and forth dialogue conversation with a person. And that person typically works with CBT approaches, which are cognitive behavioral therapy. That's a typical approach. That is important. I agree. Yes. But when we think of the deaf community and the population there, some fit into those types of therapy sessions. However, there are language issues on that spectrum that some deaf people who have experienced language deprivation have a tough time expressing their emotions or understanding what the therapists are explaining. So for these individuals, we need to use a different type of therapeutic approach. So expressive therapy uses art and interaction, plus is visual, and incorporates feelings. Individuals can draw their feelings, and that practice becomes a tool. And that's the start of expressive therapy. And it's not the end of those types of alternate therapies. There's movement therapy, there's music therapy, there's play therapy. There are different types of therapies for individuals that have different types of communication styles. We all have a different love language, right? So it's important that you find one that fits and are able to express yourself. If you have the typical in-person meeting therapy sessions going and you feel they're not a fit, I encourage you to explore alternative therapy styles like what I just mentioned, expressive therapies. And those are also considered strength-based therapies, which work with where you're at and your strengths and go from there. Both therapies are valid. However, you need to make the decision about what works for you as a person. Because again, it's not one size fits all. It's not cookie cutter. We're not all the same. We are individuals and unique. Marla speaking. Yes, thank you for sharing that. And I like to ask, how do people find out about these different therapies? Because most of us are familiar with traditional therapy, and most deaf people in the deaf community aren't aware with the variety of therapeutic approaches that exist. How can the deaf community gain insights and be more aware? Right, Marla, you ask about that. In the hearing community, there's access almost everywhere for hearing individuals. For the deaf community, there's insurance issues on top of access issues. And so we are working to expand access to mental health, which is part of my study in pursuing my PhD. There are studies and findings that indicate that expressive therapy benefits the deaf community. So I'm hoping to use that data to push the envelope and be able to engage more of these types of therapies within the deaf community. CAD has a telehealth uh, focus committee that is working on developing more of these alternative practices. And so they are doing the work there. And Marla says, okay, we've got someone that's asked a question. And the question asks, do you know how many, and this is Richard Ray, how many deaf owned mental health services exist? Is there a website with a list of mental health professionals? Noel speaking. I did share 3 resources for mental health: Deaf National Deaf Therapy, and then Deaf Therapy, and the Deaf Therapy Center. Those are nationwide. However, keep in mind, each state has their own local agency. Each state may have an organization that is local to where you live that will provide those services. There are 7 sister agencies in California, DCS in San Diego, which is a part of an agency. I do know that that's one. However, you can also check in with therapists for lists. I know that we don't have enough that serve the deaf community. In California, it's a one-page list of those who serve the deaf community, so there's not enough. Service providers, which means you've got to use family, friends, references, and also look into private practices. Marla says, so do private practices exist? Is there a list of private practices somewhere? Noel speaking, yes, there is. There is a list for the state of California. There isn't anything nationwide yet. However, we are still seeking out those professionals that can serve the deaf community. And this is Marla. Yeah, I wonder what the difference is between a deaf therapist and a hearing therapist that can sign. Is there a list that includes both? And this is Noel. Yes, there is a list that includes both deaf and hearing signing therapists. And this is Marla. Okay, let me check and see if there's follow-up questions. Oh, there is. Is there a list available of psychiatrists? The question is, can you tell us about available psychiatrists, drug alcohol treatment centers, long-term mental health residential centers? Many programs are closing or have closed. Why is that happening? Noel speaking. Oh, a touching question. There is a shortage in the states of services. Recovery programs, drug recovery programs. There is one run by DCS. It is called Signs of Life, SOL. That program is deaf community specific, run by the deaf community itself. They also have a sober living house for deaf people there. That's one program that I know of. And you're right, a couple other programs have closed or have small numbers. For example, in Los Angeles, there's a program called Awakenings. It is open for women only. So that's one. There are a couple throughout the state. For psychiatrists, there are a couple deaf psychiatrists. There is one local here, Dr. Sanjay Quality, which is a deaf psychiatrist here in the Boston area at the Boston Children's Hospital. There is another town here in Massachusetts with a deaf psychiatrist, and we're slowly starting to see them fill positions. Some hospitals have them, but they are not deaf psychiatrists. Some are hearing hospitals that have a deaf unit. Where I work, the Learning Center at the Walden School, they have an in-service treatment program for children that are 8 to 22. Children with severe mental health complications and traumas are able to access the program here. Walden School is a residential program. It operates 24 hours, 7 days a week. We offer not only the academic program, but mental health services. And I am the one that provides those services. Marla asks, what about students that are older than 18? What happens with them? Noel speaking, the service here runs till age 22. What happens after age 22? Different states have different criteria. We are restricted to those ages, 8 years of age to 22 years of age. We hope that as they exit our system, that there are warm hands that we can transition them to, like, for example, other therapy services, a group home, an independent living center, or if they've achieved those skills, independent life themselves. If they are not able to access these programs, it can be a struggle. And we do see folks fall through the cracks of the system. So we encourage everyone here within the deaf community to advocate for access to mental health services for the deaf community and the deaf population. Marla speaking, I remember a center or a program in Minnesota. It closed. I think it was only open a month and 30 days. Noel speaking, that was a recovery center and they closed due to funding issues. It was too expensive. They weren't able to afford expenses. Insurance wasn't covering. They didn't have enough people. It was a detox/rehab center is what it was. And after that program, they tend to transition to Signs of Life, spend a year there. But that program in Minnesota has closed, and the people that used to be referred to it are now being referred to Signs of Life in San Diego. Dr. Marla says, wow, fascinating. Okay, next question. And let me make sure I'm looking at the list of questions. Okay, question there says, does Dr. Sanjay Gulati serve deaf clients across the nation? This is Noel. Dr. Sanjay's sign is like this, SJ on the side of the head. Dr. Gulati does have a private practice. His focus primarily, though, is pediatrics, deaf children. He has his private practice as well as work with the Boston Children's Hospital. He is happy to consult, however, is extremely busy, but is willing to be supportive in a variety of areas. Dr. Sanjay Gulati is an extremely friendly and warm person. Dr. Marla says, yes, I've met him before. You're right. Very kind, very nice. Okay, let's move on to another question. How can we help other deaf people with their mental health? This is Noel. Before I answer that question, I wanted to mention one more thing about Dr. Sanjay. Dr. Sanjay is the only person who is officially accredited in language deprivation. And his aim is to have that included in the DSM-5. Well, actually, it would be the DSM-6, and have it recognized there, which, again, just speaks to how amazing an individual Dr. Sanjay is. And now we can return to this question that was asked. Okay, how do we help other deaf people with their mental health? That's a tough question. What you have to do, or the only thing you can do, is be there for the person. If they'd like to express something to you, be attentive to it. If they ask for support, offer it up. They might not ask. You might have to check in with them and ask them if they have found someone they're comfortable to speak with, a therapist perhaps. And if the person indicates they're not ready to take care of their mental health needs, then stay by their side and be willing to listen to them. Don't force anything on anyone if they're not ready. However, you can share resources. If you have a variety of resources, point those out to them as well. Dr. Marla here. I'm going to connect two questions. First one is, do you know how deaf people can get their insurance to pay for mental health? And many people call their insurance and say, no, that provider is not in our system. They're not covered. So how can deaf people get a deaf therapist covered by their insurance? Is there a way to do that? This is Noel. That's a huge challenge. When it comes to dealing with your insurance company, you have to do a lot of self-advocacy. You need to really explain why you need a deaf therapist and how that deaf therapist fits into your needs. Maybe you can ask your doctor to write you a letter to submit as an attachment to the insurance. Insurance sometimes does not give that approval until most people, or some people, do out-of-pocket expenses. Some therapists are happy to accept a payment on a sliding scale, which means they'll change the fee depending on your income, or some will select the payment plan. And really, that depends on the therapist. But what's most critical is that you reach out to their insurance company and battle with them to add that service provider to their list. We understand, as a deaf individual, there are hurdles to have to overcome. And having to overcome hurdles to help oneself's mental health can be very exhausting. So I'll ask you not to stop. Ask your friends and family to help in your effort to fight with the insurance to get you services, and include them so that they can be your support to that. Dr. Marla says, is it true that therapists themselves have to file or apply with an insurance company? Yes, says Noel. Dr. Marla, why wouldn't they do that? It seems like such an easy process. Noel says, well, sort of. If it's a deaf individual with a private practice, they can apply to that insurance panel, and they can become included to an insurance network. They have to pay money for that as well. Some choose not to do that. Some therapists choose to work for an agency and are contracted. For example, with San Diego County in California, they contract with DCS, Deaf Community Services, and they accept a Medi-Cal, a Medicare voucher for those services. That would be technically considered the insurance panel. I also, for those practices, can't take public insurance. Some can't take private insurance, and vice versa. So let's talk about the state of California. Medi-Cal covers visits to any social worker, family therapist license. They don't accept a professional clinician's license, only a licensed family therapy license. So that ends up restricting who can offer therapy. So depending on the insurance company's policies, it will impact where a therapist is signing up or not. Dr. Marla says, wow, very complicated. Let me see another question on our list. Okay. The question says, should we push this into a legislative bill at the federal level to award funds for deaf therapists to establish their own practices, or perhaps a bill that will help insurance companies, that will help enforce insurance companies to accept deaf professionals into their systems as therapists, as direct services to a deaf client. This is Noel. Yes, totally yes. The CAD mental health teleforce that I mentioned is one of the reasons why it was established. I am one of the chairpersons, and the other person is Shirley Barber. And we hope to expand that task force. One of our priorities is that we've identified the insurance industry problem, the licensing problem. And so we're hoping to collect more data on those to be able to package that and justify the bill, because expanding mental health services for the deaf community would benefit our population, because the deaf community is constantly dealing with barriers, systemic barriers. And if we could point those out and highlight those, then we can make some change. So part of that includes having insurance companies sign up deaf professionals, and so on and so on. And so that's part of what would be incorporated in that bill. Now, submitting a bill to legislature takes time and is a definite battle, but we definitely need the help of those of you watching tonight. If you're part of our community, join us and help us. Dr. Marla asks, do you not have enough data? Or what does that look like? What type of data do we need to collect to submit something to legislature? This is Noel. The data is lacking. We can send out surveys. For example, the state of California has different counties. There's northern, middle, southern region, and throughout those, there's different laws, different policies. What the state of California is using are surveys to build up that data, and then they prioritize the needs based off the data collected. And that is a process that takes time. So if any of you are willing to be involved and be a part of it, please reach out to me, or to Shirley as well. Dr. Marla, okay, I'll ask you one of the next questions. A whole bunch of questions for you. The question says, I felt the need to share the following information and heighten awareness among this group regarding 911 and 988 services as possible challenges for individuals who are deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing, as well as people with speech disabilities. In 2021, the FCC's Disability Advisory Committee identified and recommended that the FCC should do the following. 1. The FCC should take steps to ensure people that use text-based communications and TRS can contact local or regional non-emergency 911 and 988 services consistent with access to 911 services before and after disasters, and including for national emergencies. And we encourage local or regional non-emergency 911 and 988 services to incorporate technologies like SMS, RTT, and TRS. I hope that the information mentioned is helpful to you as we work with our community who may need these critical services. Can you speak to that, Noel? Noel speaking. Yes, I'm thrilled to have services that are text-based. Some services can't be accessed via phone call, via video phone, or via video relay service. So it's nice to be able to access them via text. However, keep in mind that even through a text, law enforcement could arise. Law enforcement, some are trained for mental health, some are not. So I hope that we can, adding those ideas are great, but we also need to go beyond that. Training or partnering with an emergency response person. In California, there's something called PERT, which is a Psychiatric Emergency Response Team, PERT, PERT. That's in California. In Massachusetts, we have PES, Psychiatric Emergency Services. That is a person that is sent along with law enforcement to do a health check. When those services do not exist, it is just an officer of the law that shows up. We have to keep in mind that law enforcement is not always familiar with deaf culture. So you want to be cautious to what you're texting, and you want to have backup or additional support ready in case something like that should occur. They should be including sign language interpreters too to facilitate communication. If a law enforcement officer arrives, they'll need to communicate during and after. Some people have trauma as well. And so that's where the deaf community needs to explain and reach out how those services work. This is Dr. Marla. Okay, we've got a couple more minutes. I see some questions about political advocacy, but I want to ask something else. Do deaf individuals realize that they have mental health issues, or are deaf people unaware of it? How can members of the deaf community recognize their own mental health issues? This is Noel. It's just not easy. This is Dr. Marla. I think it's similar to what you mentioned about the gauges and how we need to fill up our fuel and refuel. When we think about folks that are deaf and language deprived and have experienced that, they know what makes them feel good or relaxed. Like you mentioned, painting, being in a hot tub, or doing some activity that they enjoy. Are all people familiar with what makes them feel good? This is Noel. No, not everyone is familiar with what relaxes them and helps them feel good, which is why we need to have family and friends and support. Some people are unaware of what their fuel needs are, so they need to develop a system first so that they can understand what that gauge will look like. Do they need alone time? Is that what they're low on fuel on? Do they need friend time? Is that what they're low on? And basically, I encourage you to start with concentric circles. Start with yourself, expand to your friends or family, and then expand beyond that. Some people operate in denial. They deny that there are issues, mental health issues. Most do because of stigma. Others do just from being unaware. But when it comes to stigma, this is where we depend on community. Community can support each other and say, hey, are you feeling okay? Whether it be your friend, your relative, if you care about someone, it's okay that you ask them, are you all right? Do you need support? Do you need help? Do you need to check somewhere? All it takes is a second to text someone and check in with them and see how they're doing. That might have someone realize, oh boy, okay, I didn't see that I was struggling, but I am struggling. And so just like a physical ailment, we go for a check-in. You can also go for a mental health check-in. If you're just not feeling okay, I recommend that you search support when you're not feeling okay. Some people don't realize it. They continue moving forward in life. Some people deny it, and it takes some time till someone introspects and realizes it. Also, it takes patience and support to focus on your mental health. This is Marla. You're so right. I really was encouraged by what you said. Be there for that person. Noel, I see your hand up. You want to make a comment? This is Noel. Yeah, I want to add, we need to always be reminded of the cultural component, right? Some people say culture is not a part of mental health. Let me point out, some Asian cultures identify symptoms physically. For example, if you have a stomach ache, then it's considered depression. Whereas in Western perspective is if a person is sad, they have depression, right? And then in Asian culture, some cultures, they have a positive view of something that in the Western culture, we have a negative view of. And then we have to also consider the BIPOC community. A lot of the BIPOC community is traumatized from the medical model, from being treated that way. And so we want to, and there's a distrust to the medical system. So we want to be mindful of our approach with these communities. We want to be compassionate in our approach. We want to be gentle, and we want to show empathy and empathize with the individual, meet them where they're at, and work with them to see what resources they may have already and what their support system is like. Because my resources compared to somebody's resources and support system might be different. Trauma, financial, culture, all those arenas come into play. So it's very important to be mindful of culture as well and have cultural competency in those approaches. And also, we cannot decide for others. Oh, well, you're traumatized, right? Maybe in my sense, I don't feel it's trauma, but someone else cannot define that for me. If you're offering help, stay professional. You don't want to say things like, oh, you're bipolar. Oh, you're depressed. You can say things like, I think you should talk to someone. I think you should visit someone. Those types of comments lead to further stigma, and that's not the direction we want to head in. We want to head in a direction that honors and recognizes mental health and that it's important. We cannot read anyone's mind. Therefore, we have to ask them to tell us how they feel. And when you do, it's important to listen. Dr. Marla speaking. Okay. Let me look at the list of questions. I think we've run through most of them. And Noel, I've got a question for you. When it comes to deaf community that has experienced language deprivation, they have trauma, but with limited vocabulary or with limited language skills, how can they express that? How do we deal with individuals like that? Right, so a person has trauma, but doesn't have the tools or the language to be able to express it. What do we do? Noel speaking. Right. For example, with children are still in a development mode. They're still learning, they're still acquiring language. And there are milestones. With time, they will develop the language to express their feelings. Where I work at the Learning Center, I'm part of a special program called SMART. It's an acronym that stands for Sensory, Motor, Arousal, Management, Treatment. The acronym for it is SMART, and we do a sign for it, which is a 3 coming out of 1. It's a new program that includes hearing and deaf children. It's sort of like physical therapy. You've seen those rooms with cushions, springboards, exercise balls. It's something similar. They enter a room with a therapist, and the exercise is student-led. They can explore their feelings by using the various equipment without having to use language, right? And the therapist can at that point assess them via their energy levels. They can see if they are hyperactive, if they are too calm, and then can start working to try to diagnose that. Also, through that practice, some deaf individuals can act things out, and the therapist can check in on them and educate them on their feelings, what that is. Also, that practice works for defining boundaries so that they can understand boundaries. Most of the time with language deprived people, it's tough to just give a long description or explanation, but they do learn through activity. The Learning Center has received 3 different grants. One in particular is one we're using for deaf children with language deprivation, where we, again, work on identifying energy, behavior, and mood. Now, for adults that experience language deprivation, it's a lot tougher because their learning capacity is not as adept as it was. But what's important is to fit and meet them where they're at and fit into their needs. So that's where we need the extra tools like expressive therapy, where we can use that to interact with them. Or we can also use support boards, which are boards with images that talk about feelings. You can also use a support board that shows things in steps, like, for example, a photo with a number 1, waking up, a photo with a number 2, taking a shower, photo with number 3, brushing your teeth, and so on and so on and so on. And there are other support boards that just have emotions and have a whole range of emotions, and a person can choose, because it's visual, what they are feeling. And then there are also those boards that are used for choice, to offer individuals choices where all they have to do is point at the words on that board for them to make their choice. And that's a technique used with folks that have experienced language deprivation. But again, there's a whole host of techniques to work with individuals like that. This is Dr. Marla. Can I ask about a success story using one of these therapies, using maybe your expressive method? Have you seen success stories? This is Noel. Yes, one of the students I worked with last year. We had a student at the age of 8, had no language when they got to school, very little, I should say, very little language. And this child was very high energy, was always throwing tantrums, very difficult to deal with. At 8 years old, of course, we couldn't have conversations in sign language. So we took this child to the SMART program. We had some interactions, and then they learned what safety is like. They learned also through jump therapy that they could get hurt. And so we asked them, how could things get better? And through that interaction, they started pointing at things. Like, for example, they pointed at a cushion. So the next time we introduced vocabulary and said, okay, this is called a cushion. And if this is going to help you not get hurt, let's use it. So then the session after that, this student showed up saying, I need the cushion, I need that, I need this. And after a year of this type of therapy, the student developed more and more language and was able to ask for their needs. Dr. Marla says, my goodness, 8 years of age, 9, 10 years old, it's never too late to acquire language. We need to be there to support them. And Noel, I want to thank you for such a nice closing story. Oh, wait, I see one more comment. The comment number 12 there says, Medicare starting in 2024 will allow private practice therapists, including 3 agencies that are mentioned, to provide counseling, virtual counseling. Medicare and Medicaid does not allow virtual counseling and requires clients to attend a facility. An exception was made during the COVID years, and therapists working for agencies were granted the flexibility of providing virtual counseling. And I think that fits in with that 8-year-old child you mentioned. Thank you, Noel, for doing the good work. And this is Dr. Marla. Oh, I'm being told we have more questions. We have 2 more questions. Oh, I see. It's another question. The question says, I noticed you're studying for a PhD in arts. What would you like to see the outcome after you complete the PhD? Is your goal to provide more workshops and more trainings? This is Noel. Thank you, audience member, for asking. In my PhD program, my goal is to be able to collect data so I can develop an assessment for the deaf community specific, an assessment specialized for deaf individuals, and a psychological assessment as well that will include expressive therapy. And I want to encourage people to become therapists for expressive therapies so that deaf individuals can receive direct services. That is my goal. My ultimate goal is, of course, to become a college professor and to teach, which would include workshops and training. So that is part of my aim as well. This is Dr. Marla. With your knowledge and with your experience, I know that you will make a fabulous teacher. Thank you so much, says Noel. This is Dr. Marla. We will be closing at this point. As Noel showed on her slides, you have her contact information, and she encourages you to become therapist, or if you're looking for a therapist, I guess there are different areas to specialize in, like you said, musical therapy, dance therapy, and so on and so on. So any of you out there in our audience, if you love music and you love dancing or you love art, that can become a career and you can offer therapy in that hobby of yours. I want to close for our evening tonight by thanking, and the interpreter missed that, by thanking Parodi. And that is our time for tonight. Thank you so much, Noel, for visiting us and presenting to us, coming all the way from Boston to California. Thank you so much. Folks, again, she shared her contact information. You can reach out directly to Noel.